Okay. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Urbana City Council for Monday, March 27th, 2023. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Here.
Mr. Evans.
Here.
Ms. Hersey,
Here.
Ms. Colacetti,
Here.
Ms. Bishop,
Here.
Ms. Wilkin,
Here.
Mr. Quisenberry,
Here.
Mayor Marling.
Here. Next item is approval of minutes from the January 23rd, 2023 meeting. Will
So
the-
moved.
Moved by Mary Alice,
Second.
seconded by Sharice. Are there any substantial corrections? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That motion passes. Additions to the agenda, I would like to request that we move item L, which is the appointment of a Community Development Services Director, up to under unfinished business. No objections? Yeah, it would, item L would occur after unfinished business, which there is none. Unfinished business is a standing part of the agenda, so. Or you could say before reports of standing committees. Does that
I
make
thought you
sense?
meant under,
Got it.
under
Got
unfinished
it.
business, like as if it was a point of unfinished business.
No, it's not, yes, yes. Okay, we'll move on to present,
One more, I don't see council comment and communication on the agenda, so if we could, I think it's usually under public presentations and public input for council meetings, right?
There's no discussion.
Yeah, there's no discussion item. It's not currently on the agenda, so I would just ask that it be
absolutely.
put on the agenda.
So council comment. That's not. So after presentations and public input, we will have council comment and communication. And following that will be appointment. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. Presentations and public input, we have the 2023-2024 Annual Action Plan, and that will be followed by public input.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I will be providing a brief presentation on the city's 2023-2024 Annual Action Plan. This plan outlines the activities that the City of Urbana and the Urbana Home Consortium will undertake utilizing HUD funds through the year 2023-2024. This plan also explains how these activities will meet the goals, strategies, and objectives outlined in our consolidated plan. The annual action plan is completed annually, and this is part, as I mentioned, of the city's broader 5-year consolidated plan. Our current consolidated plan is 2020 through 2024. So this is first and foremost a planning document that outlines the goals and objectives for the city's 2 HUD grant programs, the Community Development Block Grant Program, or CDBG, and the Home Investment Partnership Program. The plan identifies the strategies that staff will pursue over the following year in order to address community needs. The city is required to complete this plan and submit to HUD each year. Another really critical component of this plan is community input. So as part of the annual action planning process every year, we do community outreach to get input on needs from residents. So in a bit, I'll be showing you where you can review the plan and find it on our website. As you start to look through it, you'll notice it's a pretty lengthy document. So I'm going to just highlight 3 really key areas of the plan here. So the AP 15 section, which can be found on pages 10 to 13, highlights the expected resources that the City of Urbana and the Urbana Home Consortium will receive from HUD for the year 2023-2024. The AP 20 section is the annual goals and objectives section, and this can be found on pages 15 through 19. And this section summarizes the specific goals that the city and consortium intend to initiate and or complete within the term of the program year. So in order for a goal to appear in our annual action plan, it must also appear in our consolidated plan. The AP 35 section, which is on pages 20 through 38 of the plan, this provides a summary of the eligible programs or activities that will take place during the program year in order to address those priority needs that are found in AP 20. It also outlines the strategy that staff will use in order to address those goals and objectives. So for the 2023-2024 fiscal year, the city and consortium have received our allocation from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for both of these grant programs. So for the Community Development Block Grant Program, the city will be receiving $498,343. And for the Urbana Home Consortium, we will be receiving $779,013. And I'm sure you're all familiar at this point, but the consortium includes the cities of Urbana, cities of Champaign, and Champaign County as represented by the Regional Planning Commission. So those home funds are available countywide. The City of Urbana CDBG funds are only available to be used within the City of Urbana. These allocations are relatively consistent from year to year. HUD has a formula that they use in order to determine the allocation amounts. Our CDBG allocation went down a little bit this year. Last year, I believe it was around $510,000, so it's decreased slightly, but the Home Consortium funds went up slightly, I believe, so pretty consistent from year to year. So the CDBG and the home programs, I'll just outline really quickly some of the eligible program areas that we can spend this funding on. And just a note about this before I start, these eligible categories are determined by federal statute. So we have to ensure that everything we're spending this money on is within federal statute and aligns with one of these eligible categories. So the Community Development Block Grant Program is a very flexible pot of funding that we receive. We can utilize CDBG funding for public service programming. For example, our Youth Services Grant Program is funded through the public service portion of the CDBG program. We can also spend CDBG money on public facilities or infrastructure improvements throughout Urbana, housing rehabilitation programs, blight reduction, or lead-based paint remediation. The one constant for all CDBG funding is that the funding has to go to benefit low to moderate income residents of Urbana. The Home Investment Partnership Program is a little bit more targeted. It's more specific. Home funding has to result in the creation or the sustaining of an affordable housing unit. So it's a little bit more targeted than the CDBG program. So home funds can be used for tenant-based rental assistance, which is also known as TBRA. We can utilize it for down payment assistance programs, housing rehabilitation, or the construction or development of affordable housing. So as I mentioned earlier, community needs and gaining input on community needs is a really important part of this process. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here tonight, is just to spread awareness of this plan and the need for us to really gain input from the community about how they want this money to be spent. These programs do really focus on housing and affordable housing, and we know as we look at statewide statistics that affordable housing is really a critical need. So I just have some information here that I think is important to consider. These numbers are from Housing Action Illinois, and they are statewide, but I think they do give a good indication of the affordable housing situation here in Champaign County. So statewide, we see that 71% of renters are considered severely housing cost burdened, which means they spend more than half of their income on housing costs. A minimum wage worker has to work 2 full-time jobs in order to afford rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. And only 36 of every 100 low-income renters looking to rent a home in Illinois will find one they can afford. So again, these are statewide numbers, but I think it speaks really well to the situation that we see locally in terms of affordable housing. But we also know that there are other needs in the community, and again, that CDBG pot of funding, it is pretty flexible. We can use it on programs other than just housing. So, from the community in previous years, we have heard about the need for improvements in neighborhood infrastructure, whether that's, improved sidewalks, lighting, or drainage. We also have heard, community safety and violence prevention are very important areas that, we can continue to utilize this funding for. And then also public services. So whether that's youth or special populations, we know that there's a big need in the community to support programs that provide funding and opportunities for youth in our city. So I'll just go over briefly the timeline. So again, the draft annual action plan is available for review and comment. The public comment period began on March 1st, and it runs all the way through Friday, March 31st. I will be coming back before all of you, so this is not the last you'll hear from me. I'll be back on April 17th to present the final draft of the plan to all of you, and you'll be voting to approve it. Once it's approved and finalized, and once we've incorporated all of that citizen input, we'll be submitting it to HUD. The deadline for that is May 15th. And then we hope to have our funding allocations available beginning July 1st. So some of the outreach activities we have been engaging over the past month, we have been actively sharing the plan with community and advocacy groups. We've held 2 public hearings. We will be holding our 3rd and final public hearing on the plan tomorrow before the city's Community Development Commission meeting. So that will be here in council chambers at 6 p.m. So any resident can come and provide comment on the plan tomorrow at 6 p.m. here in council chambers. And then we also have sent out a community needs survey, again, just asking residents to let us know what needs they're seeing in their neighborhoods, whether that's infrastructure, housing, kind of what they're seeing and how they think this funding can go to address those needs. And when I'm back in April, I will be sharing the results of that community needs survey. So I'll have more information once the public comment period ends. So there are several ways that you and also residents can let us know your thoughts on the plan. Again, tomorrow, Tuesday, March 28th at 6 p.m. here in council chambers, we'll be having a public hearing. Also, the grants at urbanaillinois.us email address. Residents can submit their feedback through email, or they can just give us a call. That is also a great way to get in touch with us. Also, if anyone has an issue finding the plan or is not able to locate it, they can always give us a call, and we're happy to provide that. I will say it's available on our website in the community development section of the website, and there's also a physical copy at the city clerk's office and at the front desk of the Urbana Free Library. And that is all I have for you tonight.
Any questions for Braden? Chris?
You said thanks for the presentation. You said the funds will be available July 1st. And the figures that you gave us for CDBG and home is for 2023 and 2024. So when does the money have to be spent by?
So the grant cycle tracks the city's fiscal year. However, we do tend to have, carryover. We don't have to have it all spent, within the fiscal year. HUD does allow us to carry over from year to year if we have a balance, which we typically do have a balance. As we've come before you before, there is a timeliness question where HUD doesn't want large amounts of grant funding just sitting unused. They want to see that you're engaging, with the community and having good programs. So it's a couple years, but it's not, you don't have to have it all spent within that one fiscal year.
Good, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Braden. Oh, Sharice?
This can be found online, the draft of the annual action plan,
Yes.
under community development or?
Community development, it is there. And also, anyone can email us or give us a call if you would like us to get you a hard copy as well. But it is on the website.
Okay, thank you.
Would you mind sending it out to council tomorrow, the link? so they can share it. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you, Braden. We'll move on to public input. If anyone wishes to address the council, please step up to the microphone. Seeing none, we'll move on to council comment and communication. Chris?
Well, I want to thank Esther Pat, Danielle, Ruth Wyman for their presentation tonight during the town board meeting. I too was very disturbed by last week's presentation. I really, and I looked over what Esther Pat sent in the way of the appellate ruling from 2004 and everything. I am of the opinion that there is no ambiguity in the Urbana ordinance, human rights ordinance, and that the prohibition against source of income should absolutely be enforced. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Similarly, so for folks who might not have been watching the town board meeting that happened just prior to this, we had our township supervisor as well as a couple of experts related to housing in our local community talk about, provide their feedback on the presentation that we got from city staff last week about the enforceability of the housing discrimination related to source of income. And I think that it is important to recognize that we do need additional legal clarification. As was mentioned, Esther Pat from the tenant union provided a citation that would suggest that there's a very clear path in terms of enforcing this. So I expect to see further clarification for the city council and the community. But I also want to make sure that people are aware that there are resources if they are facing housing discrimination in Urbana or in Champaign County more generally. And also to remind folks that not only has Urbana's ordinance been in place for quite some time, but now there's the statewide ordinance, and there'll be some educational opportunities coming up. So for Urbana residents, the Township Supervisor's Office phone number is 217-384-4144. For folks within the larger Champaign-Urbana community, the tenant union also is a resource that's available to people. Their phone number is 217-328-3313. And then there were two different presentations that are coming up about fair housing that'll be happening soon. The first is on Tuesday, April 4th from 6:30 to 7:30. And that'll be at the Housing Authority of Champaign County, Community Room 2008 North Market Street, Champaign, Illinois 61822. There's contact information for Nafia Khan. For more information, phone number 630-690-6500, extension 122, or Nafia, NAFIA.Khan, KHAN, @hopefair.org. That'll be the first of those presentations. Same contact information for the second and the same location, but that will be Wednesday, April 5th from noon to 1. I certainly plan to try to attend one of these sessions and want to make sure that I have as much information as possible, but I also want people to understand that there are resources. And at least myself, I believe other council will also be asking for further clarification so we can make sure we're properly enforcing our ordinance. Thank you.
Any other comments? Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Unfinished business, there is none. We'll move on next to an appointment. I'd ask Kimberly Smith and Sheila Dodd to join us at the front. Welcome. I'm very pleased to submit the following appointment for your approval. It's Kimberly Smith as Director of Community Development Services, effective April 3rd, 2023 through June 30th, 2025. Council members have received a copy of Ms. Smith's resume and cover letter, and I'll just read the bio that's included in this memo. Kimberly Smith is an economic development and planning career employee with extensive background, a passion for the work she does for the community. She earned both a Bachelor and a Master of Arts in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, as well as an MBA from Bradley University. She began her professional career as a planning intern at the City of Urbana, where she also held her first professional role as a planner in the Community Development Department. She later moved to the city of Peoria, Illinois, where she spent over 20 years, eventually becoming a senior urban planner for community development. In this position, she managed regional planning goals, code enforcement, zoning changes, and economic development issues. Kimberly directly contributed to creating long-term relationships, planning, and project implementation for 3 challenged neighborhoods. This required her to gain resident trust and commitment from large-scale institutions and other commercial employers to successfully transform these neighborhoods. She also worked to support historic building reuse and preservation, code administration, economic development, and budget management. After her tenure in Peoria, she transitioned to her most recent role in the city of Bloomington, Illinois, as Assistant Director of Economic and Community Development. Her professional focus in Bloomington has been managing the building safety, economic development, grants management, building code enforcement, and urban planning divisions. Kimberly views the opportunity to serve as Urbana's Director of Community Development Services as a homecoming, and she's excited to contribute her skills, experience, and leadership to our community once again. I also wanted to make a note about the length of the appointment. As you remember, last year, council changed appointment rules to allow for 2-year appointments. So the other department heads are on a 2-year cycle, and their appointments will all end June 30th of 2024. They'll then be subject to a 1-year appointment after that because we don't want to go beyond all of our terms will end in 2025. So the next appointment cycle will be for 1 year. So I'm asking for an exception to the rule to allow Ms. Smith's appointment to be on the same ending date as, at any rate, for June 30th of 2025. So by the time we reach 2025, all appointees will be on the same cycle and ready for the next term for elected officials. And so I would ask for an exception. If you're not comfortable with that, we will go with a 2-year appointment, which would end on April 2nd, and then we'll just have to renew it in April 3rd, for beginning April 3rd of 2025. But I hope you can make an exception. Kimberly's certainly welcome or willing to answer a couple of questions. Sandra.
Hi, thank you, welcome. I have a few questions, but I'll take them one at a time and give other space. Appreciate your interest in coming to Urbana, and you have a very extensive experience, which is, of course, welcomed. How will you work to increase diversity within the Community Development Department? You have to press the button. Yes, in terms of staff.
In terms of staff. I guess there's a number of things. It depends on, I think when you are looking for who is going to become part of your staff, you don't wait until there's an opening in the staff. It's every interaction all the time. You are always selling. And had something like where I work now, just last week we had a group of students come over, and it was to see what we do, but we viewed it as an opportunity to sell the city. So I think that's probably the biggest impact you can have on encouraging diversity and getting diversity to apply. So again, just every interaction is really kind of a future job interview interaction. So kind of looking at it from that standpoint.
And remember, this is an opportunity, this is a general opportunity, it's not a job interview. We do welcome questions. No, I understand, yeah. Absolutely. Is there any other comment or question from a council member?
What do you think is the biggest priority in community development currently, either from what you know of Urbana now, or, sort of in general in the regional community development space, since it seems like you've been sort of all over Central Illinois?
Priorities. I think growth and enhancement are two of the biggest things to look at. I think one thing that's nice about the community development department is we kind of work the circle of all of the things that contribute to having a nice place to live, a nice place for businesses to thrive, residents to have an income. So if you think about all the different things that we touch, from building safety, we have safe buildings, and an easy process for development to occur. There's grants to help those in need, economic development to encourage, again, more, to help the business that we have, to encourage more to come, thinking bigger and bigger. Planning puts it all together. It helps lay the groundwork. It looks at everything from infrastructure to how everything literally fits together, from making room for emergency services to just like say tying every type of strategic plan back together. So those key things, I think all of that really contributes to being proud of what we have, seeing what we can build on in the first place. I think there's some economic challenges that the city's seen. I've got fresh eyes on the city. I've been back. I've peeked in over the years, but I can very clearly remember, years and literally decades ago. So it's easy for me to see a progression of where things were, where they've ended up. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to renew in terms of historic preservation, and that speaks to affordability. It speaks to sustainability as well. I think there's a lot of growth doesn't necessarily mean changing borders. It just means back to increasing tax base, making it easier for those that live here, and just economic opportunity for everyone. So attraction, like say, is something larger as well, and just truly setting the stage. Comes down to those two things.
Grace.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us just kind of a summary on an example of the transforming challenged neighborhoods in some of your past work, particularly if any of them emphasize a focus on equity.
On equity. Yeah. There have been a number of things that remember I was specifically speaking of Peoria. I've been in that for a very long time. It was almost 21 years. And so over time, we had a number of different projects. We had, there was a focus on the South Side. And the South Side was an area that started out, I'm talking 1800s, like workers' housing. And then over time, as industry went away, and then those of means, quite frankly, moved out, and who was left behind, you had a lot of highly impoverished, you had single mothers, you had challenges from that level, and then you had those that just kind of dug in and stayed because they loved their neighborhood. And we did, one of my favorites was essentially a corridor study, but it was basically an economic revitalization of what are we going to do with one of these corridors? How are we going to bring in, actually, quite literally, developer interest in building in an area where the numbers just don't pan out at all. So how do you get that to happen? And how do you promise that to residents that over time have been promised over and over, hey, something's going to happen, something's going to happen. Oh, we've seen this before, we've seen this before. So in that example, it was kind of getting real. Like if we started out with student projects and kind of progressed all the way to, we had an architectural firm just draw what it could really look like and set those expectations. Starting with student projects, it was a little too exciting, and we got a lot of, am I on? Yeah. We got a little, okay, when's that going to happen? That's an idea. But then when we went all the way to the architects drawing a real plan that brought in, here's where you can have a job, here's where you can have workforce, here's where you can have a place where you can, a shared living environment that's got daycare and shared cooking opportunities and that sort of thing. So the gaining trust was over time, just working with the right officials, residents. Some of that took, for another project, it was actually several different neighborhoods, door-to-door surveys, and just showing, hey, we care, we're out here. Beyond surveys, just at every meeting, having, just getting to know them, becoming, as much as you can, part of that, the neighborhood, and understanding what the real issues are. Not, I'm just staff that's just here, and here's another plan. It's showing how can we actually make these work, and then also bringing in investors, large organizations that needed to have a focus. So some of those things that we talked about, or that I just mentioned, involved, a healthcare facility, and things that you needed others from other parts of the city to care and actually make that happen. What I'm speaking of all kind of culminated right before COVID, and then in the middle of COVID, I left. So I can't speak to, in the end, how it turned out for all of that. But through the years, building up, probably went on kind of a long time, but it's exciting, and it's hard to pick one thing, and it's hard to push it all into one comment.
I had a question maybe more for the city side. If you could help us differentiate economic and community development, since those are separate departments for us here, correct?
Economic development is a part of the community development department. It's a division.
Oh, it is under that. And so what would be, I guess, so under community development and then economic development's a piece, if you'd help, what are some of the other pieces under that umbrella?
Sure. There's economic development, planning, building safety and code enforcement, and grants.
Thank you.
And I will say that's one of the things that Ms. Smith reason she was a standout for us was her experience in departments with almost this very same structure and experience in all these areas. And when you're in a smaller department like ours, you have to wear many hats. And we, look forward to utilizing her experience in her previous positions. And we've got time for one more question. Sharice.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say welcome, for one thing. The other thing, my ward went to a grocery store. Okay, and I've been saying this for years. We went grocery store, went bank branch of some kind. We need essential services in my ward. So, and I mean north of University Avenue and west of Lincoln Avenue, thereabouts. So I would appreciate anything that you can possibly do to grow and add growth, revenue, so on and so forth, to my ward.
I'll take
Yeah,
her on
I'm
a
first
tour.
in line.
I'll take her on a tour, Sharice.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right. I would appreciate a motion. Sharice.
I would like to move for the appointment of Kimberly Smith as Community Development Services Director to be our Community Services, Development Services Director from now until 2025, actually, so that we can try to have that even up. That's my motion.
April 3rd, 2023 through June 30th, 2025.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? Well, Chandra?
The city has been working a lot lately on doing things with the lens of racial equity and inclusion, and I hope that you will be taking that lens through this position as well, if you're appointed.
Grace?
Definitely agree and echo what Councilmember Bishop has been saying here. And yeah, in general, I'd love to see more diversity in leadership and stuff. I'm not part of the selection hiring process, so I know there's more detailed stuff that we're not a part of. But in general, I definitely am supporting more diverse recruiting and hiring, and hope that we can incorporate that into the city operations for sure. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Yes.
Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey?
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti?
Yes.
Ms. Bishop?
No.
Ms. Wilkin?
Present.
Quisenberry.
Yes.
That motion passes. Thank you. We'll move on to reports of the standing committees. Councilmember Colasetti.
On behalf of the Committee of the Whole, we have 2 items on the consent agenda for approval. First is Resolution Number 2023-03-014R, supplemental resolution for improvement under the Illinois Highway Code State Motor Fuel Tax for Boneyard Creek Crossing Bridge Repair Design, and Resolution Number 2023-03-015R, supplemental resolution for improvement under the Illinois Highway Code State Motor Fuel Tax for Savannah Green Alley Rehabilitation Construction. Recommending for approval.
Second.
One second.
Moved by Jaya, seconded by Sharice. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey?
Yes.
Ms. Colasetti?
Yes.
Ms. Bishop?
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin?
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
And then next, we had ordinance number 2023-03-006, an ordinance amending Chapter 21 of the Urbana City Code pertaining to land development. And I know we had some questions. Looks like John Zeman's coming back for us.
All right. Well, good, good evening, Council. We'll say we made our attempt to respond to your questions and comments over email.
Speak up, John.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We responded to your questions and comments about the Land Development Code by email and by including some revisions in the council packet, along with a 2-page summary of revisions and supplemental information. And hoping that council's gotten a chance to review that. I guess I'd entertain any questions that remain, any other concerns council has.
Mary Alice.
So thank you for making the updates and for sending a summary. It's nice to be able to see 2 pages instead of how many pages? 63 pages. I did go through it again a couple of times. And I had emailed you a couple of questions about PUDs, and Kevin, I think, is back there, hiding back there. Oh, you're hiding over there. Sorry, that's Tim over there. Had responded in terms of the PUD. So just for some background for City Council, this document only pertains to PUDs in the EJT, not within the city. So my question, which I understand, which makes a lot of sense, but, you know, one of my questions was, what happens if a developer buys up a portion of a block and demolishes all the house? Well, now they're quote-unquote developing land, right? So I don't know if it's appropriate to state that for any PUD within the city limits, this land code doesn't apply to them. That's my understanding based on what Kevin said in the email today. Am I understanding that correctly?
Okay, there we go. No, so the PUDs are regulated by the zoning ordinance, but they are also considered development according to this code. So if there are parts of this code that apply that aren't covered in the zoning ordinance under PUDs, then the developer would be subject to those, is still subject to the land development code. So they.
Okay, so my question was, in terms of a minor development, I believe, my memory serves, it was 5 parcels or fewer was a minor one, which I think could be quite common with PUDs, right? And so that's why I was trying to figure out, how does that intersect with the PUD, all the information about the PUDs, because the minor the minor developments just go through administrative review. They do not go to the Plan Commission unless there's, unless they don't agree at the administrative review, right?
Yeah, that's correct. But the PUD process laid out in the zoning ordinance essentially It requires the same things that development require under the Land Development Code. So everything that the code requires of a minor or a major development is built into the PUD process already. It's just administered through the Plan Commission and City Council under that separate PUD
Okay.
section of the zoning ordinance.
So then, just to summarize, this land code does apply to PUDs within but it doesn't overwrite the PUD requirements in the zoning ordinance. The PUD requirements in the zoning ordinance required to go to Plan Commission and then to City Council for approval.
Right, and we tried to clarify with these revisions. We tried to sort of strip out anything that would be confusing. So that's why we took, for instance, the definition of planned unit development, and it actually had some things in there that kind of defined them. But in this version, we just said PUDs are defined in the zoning ordinance. So it will direct people there, so they know that's where it's dealt with.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions? Is there a motion for approval?
I'll move for approval ordinance number 2023-03-006, an ordinance amending Chapter 21 of the Urbana City Code pertaining to land developments.
Second.
Moved by Chandra, seconded by Sharice. Further discussion?
Thank you very much to staff for a tremendous amount of work, and this is a very hard and lengthy process, and I appreciate the work that went into this. I'm hoping that what I got out of our talks individually with staff was that this new plan will provide clarity to the developers as to what the expectations are, the building expectations are in Urbana, and that clarity provides, an easier process for them to build and develop in Urbana. So I'll be voting for this because I'm hoping that's what happens.
Any other comments? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey?
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti?
Yes.
Ms. Bishop?
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin?
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry?
Yes.
Motion passes.
The next item on the regular agenda, on behalf of the Committee of the Whole, was resolution number 2023-03-016R, supplemental resolution for improvement under the Illinois Highway Code State Motor Fuel Tax for Springfield Avenue from Wright Street to McCullough Street resurfacing design and construction.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Jay, is seconded by Chandra. Discussion. Mary Alice.
So I believe this is the one where I asked and said which projects were going to be delayed because of this. And Tim's hiding back there now. If I remember correctly, you said something about Illinois and Kohler, is that right?
When we talked after the meeting last week, just looking at the existing capital improvement plan, those are the two projects within this fund that are the furthest out. They're in year 5 of our current CIP. So if we stick with the standard prioritization process that we've worked for other projects, those would inherently be the most likely, as discussed. I think John's looked in this a little bit more, though.
Yeah, and I pointed to is the Kohler Avenue project there from Green to Maine, which driven largely by the bridge that's in poor condition. And just when I sent the email out to council last Friday, I believe it was, just to note that, if this Kohler Avenue bridge needed to be delayed another year because of these funds increase, it poses the kind of risk it poses to the city is that most likely of, say, increased weight restriction, say reducing the amount of traffic and travel over it, which is a fairly lightly traveled bridge as it is. So not a great risk to the city if we have to delay that project.
I just know that we actually I think it was over the Boneyard Creek, there was a bridge that was crumbling that we had to reprioritize, right? We had to bump it up the list because of, it was dangerous. Okay, all right, thank you.
Questions? Clerk, please call the roll.
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey? Yes. Ms. Colacetti?
Yes.
Ms. Bishop?
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin?
Yes.
Quisenberry?
Yes.
That motion passes. Thank you, Jaya. Reports of special committees, there are none. Reports of officers.
I'd just like to ask Dave Wessner to give an update on the research he's done into the Crisis Pregnancy Center issue that was presented about a month ago.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll kind of give, at least a brief update as it kind of sits today. As I commented at the last meeting, indicated there was a U.S. Supreme Court case that touched on the idea of what I would classify, and I think I said at that time, was government-compelled speech. That indicated that what was proposed would be declared unconstitutional, and I did check to see if there was any changes to that, and I didn't see any. What I would offer is that case was from 2017, and if you think about a 5-year period for the U.S. Supreme Court, not a lot of time in terms of maybe a change of makeup and a change of decision from a prior case, so I wasn't surprised that there maybe wasn't anything currently, but I did want to check just to make sure that, there wasn't anything else out there that might play into that. So that kind of currently stands as it is. What came up during the meeting was some thoughts about special use permit, and then the reality, I think, of the discussion centered on deceptive practices. What indicated briefly during that meeting was, in terms of the general concept of zoning, just saying that we don't want this kind of business to locate in the city, indicated that you can't really zone things out of existence. And so I just wrote down a couple of examples where courts have said you really can't just zone these out of existence. And I had mentioned adult uses. That's the easiest example, I think, that people were really hot on quite a number of years ago. But I found some others that I thought were actually kind of strange that communities did try and take this step, which were mobile home parks and daycare homes, where they tried to zone those out of existence in their communities, and the courts have said, no, you really couldn't do that. So as a general zoning proposition, that's kind of where that sits. In terms of the idea of special use permit, again, understand that's kind of a different concept and thought about. Maybe if we just make them get a special use permit, maybe there's some things within that dynamic that might be able to impact it. And I think in previous discussions for different kinds of things that happen relative to special use permits, I've indicated that if you think about zoning and even special use permits, it's outward facing. To a degree, you do look at the operation inside the four walls, but only to the extent of how it impacts kind of the neighboring properties. And so, I don't know that special use permits really get to kind of the point of the discussion in terms of the actual operation within the four walls of this kind of business to say, we can structure it this way to prevent what we understand to be, a problem by them. And so I don't know that that would be useful in terms of really getting to our point. And so what that leaves you with is deceptive practices, at least from the previous discussions. And I'll just say it at this point, I'm always open. Any thoughts, in terms of, would you think about this? Let's think this through kind of concept. I'm always open. If there are other thoughts after tonight, even just share them with me, and I can certainly think about those, kind of walk through a path of that to see if there might be a path in terms of impacting, I think, the nature of the discussion. So in terms of deceptive practices, the city does not have an ordinance that regulates the idea of deceptive practices. I'm not sure many communities do. I will say I didn't go out and do a search of a lot of communities to see if they did or didn't. So I would be a little surprised if a lot of communities did. In the nature of what that really gets to, and I think Councilmember Quisenberry commented, I think at the last time, is if you think about the nature of this kind of entity that's located throughout the state of Illinois, that the Attorney General's office has an arm of it that deals with this kind of concept, either as a standalone business or as a group of entities that are similarly situated, can step into the idea of, if there are deceptive practices being utilized by them, has more of a capability, I think, to address that concept. And certainly, City of Urbana is probably not the only location, again, that these kind of locate. So you think about it, it's kind of a statewide perspective on that. And, the Attorney General's office may be a good mechanism to at least contact and say, we're concerned about this and we would like to step in and address that. to get their viewpoint and thoughts about whether or not that's something they've dealt with maybe, and see what the response and ultimate result has been. Or if not, ask them if there is a possibility of stepping into that, whether that's a direct contact with the Attorney General's office or through our state legislators of saying, we believe this to be a problem. Has the legislature even thought about this concept before? And you know, is there any path that they're considering in terms of addressing what ultimately seems to be the issue, which is literally just the operation of that business itself? I think, again, as Councilmember Quisenberry, and I apologize for keep commenting about him, but he's correct, too, in that the issue related to this is the fact that they're unlicensed. I mean, they're not a healthcare facility that it's subject to a license by the state or anyone else. And that makes it difficult to step into regulation. When you're licensing things, there's possibilities of doing some regulation, whether it's a large extent or a small extent. Licenses make it easier to do that. If you just think about liquor licenses issued by the city, you know, those license holders can be regulated to a certain extent because we license them. And so we should be able to kind of look at their business and make sure that they're doing some things properly. And so, you know, that's where I think here is, you know, potentially a little bit of, got to put the thinking cap on this one because they're just not licensed. In order to address the actual operation, that's kind of where these kinds of things land. So again, just a quick update. Again, always open to thoughts and suggestions about, well, let's think about this possibility and just kind of walk that through and see.
Chris?
Thanks, Dave. First question, when you define zoning out of existence, does that mean prohibition, you can't come to our city?
Yes.
Okay. Second question, on special use permit, there is the concept, as I remember it, injurious to the general welfare. And I don't know enough about these pregnancy centers to suggest there is an injury to the general welfare, but could that concept somehow apply?
I think I get that's a good thought. You know, in terms of zoning, I'm always thinking about the idea of that generally is driven by injurious to the public health, safety, and welfare in terms of who's located around that facility to say, am I injuring it? And I understand what your thought process here. I'm just saying is, in general, that's how zoning looks at it. If we're thinking about the idea of that concept being more broad in terms of a community-based thought process of it's impacting the health of the community in terms of those individuals who may need to seek those services, yeah, we can certainly think that through and see if there's anything that, you know, could be relative to that. The problem is that those special use permits and those conditions are driven to, you know, more so, again, like I said, the conditions of how do I impact just around my four walls in terms of, you know, completely outward to the entire community. And so I would want to look into research and see if communities have even thought about that concept before, is how broad can you actually get in terms of a spectrum of a condition placed in a special use permit.
Right, and what's happening inside the building, is that harming people that go to that building? That's what I'm...
Yeah, and I kind of recall, we touched on that a little bit in terms of the jail expansion. I don't want to touch on a hot topic. I know it stirred strong feelings. And that's why I said earlier is that to a degree you look at the operation inside the four walls, but only in the sense of how does it impact the neighboring properties around it versus what's happening inside the four walls that affects the people that actually go inside the four walls on that. And that's where it's a little bit different. I've not run across that kind of concept in dealing with a condition on a special use permit for in that context of a very broad spectrum of, you know, impact.
Last question. There is one of these centers in Champaign. Did you look at what's going on in Champaign and what are the...
I didn't get that far. I can
Okay.
certainly see, again, and even see if they've got anything in their codes that actually even speak directly to this and what they may do or not do. So I can reach out to them.
Grace?
Thanks for looking into this and following up in our agreed upon timeframe. Definitely appreciate that. Sounds like maybe haven't seen the proposed state bill, House bill on this. I just sent a link to you two to see some more on that. And some of the community groups that have been involved in some of the research and presentations also highlighted this to my attention and are interested in some more follow-up. So I appreciate the offer and openness to hear more and continue the conversations because I think they'll have some input on that as well. So again, I sent that information. And I'm also curious about home rule allowances, that as a home rule municipality, what rights do we have as far as a standalone ordinance like our human rights ordinance and discrimination? It seems like we have the authority to set those kinds of fees under our home rule. And so I don't understand all the nuances, but I would definitely appreciate looking into that. And if you could send some things in writing, the Supreme Court case that you mentioned and some of those concretely in writing so that we could have some more information.
Mary Alice.
Thank you for the continuing conversation and thoughts about this process. One thing that kind of struck me as we were talking, you had mentioned that these types of facilities aren't licensed, so it's difficult. So my question is there anything stopping the city from requiring a license? We require taxi drivers to have a license.
You can certainly, again, appreciate the thought about the ideas I touched on. I figured that may be a point of conversation for tonight as well. And I'm not making any assumptions or just a thought process about the idea of tax cabs. My experience for tax cabs is more so because you want to do a background on the drivers, and the reason for that is you actually are containing an individual inside a vehicle that you're in control of, and the idea behind those was more driven to doing background checks to prevent injury to the people that are actually contained inside, the cab. Understand maybe the thought process, let's expand it to a building, I suppose, too, in terms of how you would approach the idea of, licensing this kind of entity, I suppose. And so, yeah, again, just we'll think through the idea of what that process would look like to license this kind of specific business.
Any other thoughts? Thank you. Please.
Okay, I guess the way from what you were saying before, what I gathered is that this is definitely a hard bone to chew, based on the fact that all of this particular type of business is more based on a belief system and one's opinion or one's thoughts of what's good or what's bad, which also goes on to imply a person's freedom of speech, belief, so on and so forth. Because we don't license, we can't license a person's what they believe and so on and so forth. That's that whole double-edged sword thing with the Constitution. One person's freedom fighter is another person's insurrectionist and so on and so forth. And I hate the idea of a misinformation business being in our community. At the same time, I know that there are freedoms that everybody has, and just like we don't like that freedom, and you have people that picket and harass people that going into Planned Parenthood and so on and so forth. Guess what? There's another side to that too, where folks can do the same with those businesses and inform the public that there is some deception in their practices. And I don't think that would be against the law or against the Constitution, which we are taking oaths to uphold. Can you tell me if I'm right, wrong, thinking, or legally? I'm going to think what I want to think, but legally, on a legal track, is that a step that can be taken?
If you're talking about the picketing concept, I think the answer to your question is yes. It's no different, as you've said, is I suppose you know, this is not going to come across well probably, but turnaround's fair play. I mean, you know, it used to be picketing was the province of unions. They love to picket the potential employer, potential business who didn't use union labor in terms of their construction. But there are other situations that you end up seeing picketing, and this is one of them. And I think that is just because one side doesn't mean the other side can't. You know, picketing, I think, is kind of a long-standing tradition, I suppose, if you say it in the United States about the ideas. If I don't like that and I get a group together, we're going to go over there and put up our signs and, you know, pound our fists, you know, against what the operation of that business is. And so, yeah.
Do you have any idea how Champaign is handling this? Because my understanding also is that they have not one, but two of these particular entities in Champaign. And someone came knocking on my door just last week to sign a petition regarding that. And I was like, I really don't know how to handle this.
I don't, and I appreciate the question earlier, too, I think from Councilmember Evans on the idea of maybe touching base with Champaign, because they already have one, and maybe they've kind of stepped into this arena already and have dealt with it in a certain fashion. I guess I have not seen anything publicly, and if I missed it, I suppose. But certainly I plan on reaching out to the attorney's office in Champaign and they're saying, hey, look, you know, this is obviously a topic of discussion here. We know that there's one or multiple located in the Champaign area, and get their thoughts about what they've done or not done in relation to what the discussion is centered on for those kinds of entities.
Okay, thank you.
Jan?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the update. I was going to bring up the same thing Grace did about the current Senate bill. There also have been a few attempts in the House that I think didn't pass. So I'd be curious to see kind of what happened with those two. It might be instructive to see what's happened on the state level and what's happening right now around this question. And I think, you know, as this applies to whatever people might believe in terms of access to reproductive health care, I think it's important that we're talking about deceptive practices, right? And so I hear that, right, of there are questions of, you know, what does it mean if you're picking a side in terms of a, you know, an issue, which I think it is really important that we're having conversations about reproductive health care right now, especially, but I think this is different, right? This is not just talking about protesting or picketing. This is people who are presenting themselves as authorities who are misleading people at a very, very vulnerable time. So, yeah, I would just reinforce the importance of looking at what's in the works on the state level, because it might be really instructive in terms of what challenges might be out there, both in terms of the current one and whatever happened with the previous ones.
Any other comments? Thank you, Dave. If we have one item of new business, which is resolution number 2023-03-017R, which is a resolution authorizing execution of an intergovernmental agreement for residential electronics and household hazardous waste collection. Scott Tess and Courtney Kwan.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Scott Tess, Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the city. I'm joined by Courtney Kwong, Recycling Coordinator for the city, and I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to summarize this agenda item for you.
Good evening.
Courtney, can you turn on your mic and speak into it?
Yes, good evening. Since the early 2010s, the City of Urbana has partnered with Champaign County, City of Champaign, and Village of Savoy to conduct semi-annual electronics recycling events. And in the past 3 years, we've conducted annual household hazardous waste events. We are bringing forth this intergovernmental agreement, which is really a cost-share agreement based on population, to conduct the electronics and household hazardous waste events collection events this year. The Urbana cost share is 18.6% of total costs, with a maximum total annual spend of just over $9,000. And I just want to note that these funds are already allocated in the use cycle budget. So we are seeking approval of the 2023 intergovernmental cost share agreement for the electronics recycling and household hazardous waste event collections for this year. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Any questions for Courtney? Chris?
First, a comment, this doesn't happen enough. I mean, we need to be, I mean, my basement alone, we could be doing this every week. But I guess, where are we at with do we need a permanent facility? I think we invested American Rescue Plan's money, partial funding toward a permanent facility. Where are we, do you know anything about it, and how likely is it to happen and all that?
The Champaign County Environmental Stewards, which is a nonprofit organization, is kind of taking the lead on that right now. And I think there's a very good chance, I think they've kind of identified some properties that could be potentially used for a household hazardous waste collection site.
Yeah.
And so I think it's becoming more likely that we can have a permanent site, hopefully in the near future, based on, I think they just have to, we got some funding from ARPA, and I think they're securing some other funds, and hopefully we can move forward in that direction. And that's kind of one of our goals that we've been having for quite a number of years.
Okay, so is this event going to be out at the Parkland parking lot again, or where's it at?
Yes, the electronics events will be at Parkland this year, Parkland parking lot. And then the household hazardous waste event is going to be slated for State Farm, their parking lot.
Questions related to this resolution or this agreement? Grace?
Trying to think if this is a question. I'm just going to say it. I agree with Chris's thoughts on the cost and definitely needing more of these more regularly. And my understanding too is that they do max out. These are really popular events. They get full. I don't think I've even ever made it to one. It's like full already by then. So yeah, I've just got the years of old electronics piled up. And definitely agree the need for the permanent facility. And again, disclosing being a board member of the Champaign County Environmental Stewards, and that plan's still going. And I think one of the options would be a cost share with the municipalities. So also from the city perspective, thinking about how much we're paying for these one-time events, and how much would it be a contribution to have a permanent facility. And my anticipation is that will be less cost per availability to the residents to have a permanent one than some of these one-day events that take a lot more setup and work and taking down, and just kind of different than a permanent place. So I agree with that concern, and I'm sorry, it turns out it wasn't a question. Thank you.
James, question?
Yeah, thank you for this. I'm very supportive of this. One thing I always asked Susan Monty when I was talking to her about this for the Champaign County is, with regard to the electronics recycling, what is the current landscape for some of the scrap and recycling private companies for taking on electronics recycling right now?
You mean locally or just in
Speak into the
general?
mic,
I'm
please.
sorry,
Yeah,
locally? or-
locally, historically, there have been a couple that would take certain kinds of electronics recycling, just drop it off. If it were things like TVs, they might charge extra for if they were particularly large items. But there's always been a pretty healthy number of choices for certain kinds of electronics that if residents have them, they could drop them off anytime, as opposed to the focused recycling event.
That is correct. So we have listed on the U-Cycle website several retailers and businesses in the Champaign-Urbana area that take different electronic devices year-round, like computers and monitors and printers and cell phones and things like that. I would say that the hardest item to recycle at this point are televisions. I think Best Buy is the only place, if I can say their word, but they're the only place locally that will take TVs, but it's a larger fee. I think it's maybe $25 to $50 depending on the size of the television. So it's pretty costly to recycle. So for these events, I would say about 75% of what we receive, 70 to 75%, are televisions, because that's the biggest need at this point in the community. So if we did have a drop-off in the future, that would be very helpful, because we mainly collect a lot of televisions at these collection events.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Is there a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Okay.
I move approval of resolution number 2023-03017R, a resolution authorizing execution of an intergovernmental agreement for residential electronics and household hazardous waste collection.
There's a second.
A second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by JF. Further discussion? Oh, James.
Yeah, I do want to say that I do support these events, because I think even though it's prohibited, I think some of these things find their way into the waste stream anyway, and they're not supposed to. These events get people interested, they get excited, they take their stuff, that's great. I did ask about the other alternatives because I want people to understand that there are other ways to get rid of your electronics in a safe and approved way. For the hazardous waste, it's absolutely necessary. This is something, this is why I supported that for the ARPA fund, because we need a permanent way to get rid of those things longer term. Thank you.
Further discussion? The clerk, please call the roll.
Yes.
Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey?
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti?
Yes.
Ms. Bishop?
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin?
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry?
Yes.
That motion passes. Next item, this discussion is kind of an errant item on the agenda. So the appointments have been done, and there's no further business before this meeting. We are adjourned.